Number single mom takes bullets for a stranger's child. 2 days later, the doorbell rings. Blood still stained the floorboards where Jessica Williams had collapsed just 48 hours ago, 3 bullets buried deep in her flesh, her life bleeding out to save a stranger's child. Now, as the doorbell's haunting chime cut through the suffocating silence of her apartment, she knew with bone-chilling certainty that her heroic act had marked her for death. "Mommy, why are you shaking?" 7-year-old Tyler's whispered question pierced through Jessica's terror like a knife through her heart. She pulled him closer against her chest, feeling his small body tremble as her own fear infected him. The doorbell rang again, each note echoing like a funeral dirge through their tiny sanctuary. They called her a hero on the evening news. Strangers sent flowers and cards, praising her courage, her selflessness, her maternal instinct that drove her to shield an unknown child from a hail of gunfire. But heroes in fairy tales didn't wake up screaming from nightmares of muzzle flashes and children's cries. Heroes didn't check their locks 7 times each night or jump at every shadow that moved past their window. The doorbell's third ring was different somehow, patient, deliberate, like the sound death makes when it finally comes knocking. Jessica's hands shook so violently she could barely hold Tyler as the terrible truth crashed over her like ice water. When she threw herself between those bullets and that little girl, she hadn't just saved a life. She had stumbled into something dark and deadly, something that had been hunting in the shadows long before she ever knew it existed. And now it had found her. 2 days earlier, life had been beautifully ordinary. Jessica's world revolved around the simple rhythm of survival and love. Every morning began the same way, wrestling Tyler out of bed, packing his lunch with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how many dollars remained in her checking account, and walking him to school before her shift at the diner began. Their conversations were filled with his excited chatter about Pokemon cards and playground adventures, while her mind quietly calculated bills and grocery lists. Their apartment was small but warm, decorated with Tyler's crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator and secondhand furniture that Jessica had transformed with colorful throws and pillows. She had learned to make magic from very little, turning movie nights on their worn couch into grand adventures with homemade popcorn and elaborate blanket forts. Tyler never seemed to notice what they lacked, because Jessica had become an expert at showing him everything they had. But beneath her cheerful exterior, Jessica carried a weight that threatened to crush her some nights. Lying awake after Tyler fell asleep, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder if she was enough, if her love could truly substitute for all the things she couldn't provide. The fear of losing him, to her own inadequacy, to circumstances beyond her control, to the cruel randomness of a world that seemed designed to separate mothers from their children, lived in her chest like a constant ache. There had been signs, though she didn't recognize them at the time. 3 days before everything changed, she'd met another mother at Riverside Park. The woman sat alone on a bench while her daughter played on the swings, but something about her posture set off alarms in Jessica's mind. She held herself like someone expecting bad news, her eyes constantly scanning the area as if searching for threats that only she could see. When their eyes met briefly, Jessica saw a terror so raw and desperate that it made her stomach clench. The woman looked away quickly, gathering her daughter with urgent whispers before disappearing into the afternoon crowd. Jessica found herself thinking about that encounter for days afterward, unable to shake the feeling that she had witnessed someone running from something terrible. What Jessica didn't know was that the woman, Linda Rodriguez, was indeed running. She had witnessed her husband's murder by members of the Petrov crime organization, and her daughter Emma was the only family she had left. The men hunting them had been closing in for weeks, following a trail of credit card transactions and security camera footage across 3 states. Linda's desperate search for safety had led them to this quiet suburban town, but even here, she could feel death breathing down her neck. The morning of the shooting dawned bright and cloudless, the kind of September day that made Jessica grateful to be alive. She had promised Tyler they would make his favorite chocolate chip cookies after school, and she hummed softly as she made her way to Morrison's Market for ingredients. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh, and she grabbed a small cart, mentally reviewing her shopping list. The store buzzed with its usual afternoon activity, elderly misses. Thompson examined avocados near the produce section while her grandson played with a small toy car at her feet. A teenage employee restocked shelves, earbuds blocking out the world around him. Jessica moved through the aisles with the efficient grace of someone who shopped here twice a week, selecting generic brands and comparing prices with practiced ease. She was reaching for a bag of chocolate chips when the first shot rang out. The sound was so sharp and unexpected that for a moment, her brain refused to process it. Then came the screaming, the crash of shopping carts overturning, the thunderous stampede of feet as people realized what was happening. Jessica dropped to her knees behind an end cap display, her heart exploding into a rhythm that threatened to tear her chest apart. Through the chaos, she could see him, a man in dark clothing moving methodically through the store, his weapon raised with practiced precision. His face was a mask of cold determination, and Jessica understood with terrifying clarity that this wasn't random violence. This was an execution, and he was hunting specific prey. The gunman's voice cut through the screaming, speaking words in a language Jessica didn't recognize but in a tone that made her blood freeze. She pressed herself lower against the shelving, praying to become invisible, when she heard it, a small, terrified sob coming from somewhere near the dairy section. It was the sound of a child in mortal danger, and every maternal instinct Jessica possessed ignited like wildfire. Against every rational thought screaming in her head, she lifted her eyes above the pasta boxes that concealed her. There, crouched behind an overturned shopping cart 15 feet away, was a little girl with dark hair and wide brown eyes. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and she was completely exposed. The gunman was advancing toward her location, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried. Jessica's mind fractured into 1,000 calculations in the space of a heartbeat. The distance to the child, the angle of approach she would need, the likelihood that she could reach her before the gunman noticed, the mathematical certainty that someone, probably both of them, would die if she tried. And threading through all of these cold facts was one truth that burned brighter than her fear. She could not watch a child die while doing nothing. She launched herself forward with a mother's desperate strength, her sneakers finding purchase on the slick linoleum as she sprinted toward the little girl. Time seemed to stretch and compress around her, each second lasting an eternity, while the entire encounter flashed by in an instant. She could see the gunman turning toward the sound of her movement, could see his weapon swinging in her direction, could see the little girl looking up at her with hope and terror warring in her young face. Jessica threw herself over the child just as the first bullet found her shoulder, spinning her halfway around with its impact. The second bullet caught her in the chest, stealing her breath and sending fire through her lungs. The third punched into her side as she twisted to shield the little girl completely, her body becoming a human barrier between innocence and death. As she collapsed, Jessica's vision began to gray at the edges, but she could feel the child beneath her, warm, breathing, alive. The little girl was whispering something in Spanish, words Jessica couldn't understand, but that sounded like prayers or promises, or maybe just the desperate babbling of fear. Jessica wanted to tell her everything would be okay, wanted to stroke her hair and sing her quiet songs until the terror passed, but darkness was rushing up to claim her. Her last conscious thought was of Tyler, and how he would handle coming home from school to find his mother gone. The weight of that imagined devastation pressed down on her harder than her physical wounds, and she slipped into unconsciousness with his name on her lips and the little girl's heartbeat fluttering against her chest like a trapped bird. Jessica drifted back to consciousness in stages, first becoming aware of beeping machines and antiseptic smells, then the sharp ache in her shoulder and the deeper, more troubling pain in her chest. Hospital rooms had a particular quality of light that seemed designed to remind patients they were hovering between worlds, and as her vision cleared, she found herself staring at ceiling tiles while trying to remember why breathing felt like such an effort. The memories returned in a rush that made her gasp, which sent lightning through her injured ribs. The gunman, the little girl, the sound of bullets finding their mark in her own flesh. She tried to sit up, panic flooding her system as she realized she didn't know what had happened after she'd fallen. Had the child survived? Had the gunman been caught? How long had she been unconscious? A nurse appeared at her bedside, as if summoned by her distress, a kind-faced woman with gentle hands who helped her settle back against the pillows. "Easy, honey," she murmured, checking the machines that monitored Jessica's vital signs. "You've been through hell, but you're going to be okay. The little girl you saved is fine, not a scratch on her. You're a hero, Jessica Williams." The word felt foreign and uncomfortable in Jessica's ears. Heroes were people in movies, people who made conscious choices to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. She had simply reacted on instinct, the same way she would have reacted if Tyler had been in danger. But as the hours passed and visitors began arriving, Jessica realized that the outside world had indeed decided she was heroic. Local news crews wanted interviews. The mayor sent flowers. Strangers left cards and gifts with the hospital staff, praising her courage and selflessness. But beneath the praise and attention, Jessica felt a growing unease that she couldn't quite name. Something about the shooting felt unfinished, like the first chapter of a story that was far from over. On her second day in the hospital, the little girl's family came to visit. The woman Jessica recognized immediately. It was the frightened mother from the park, though now she looked even more haunted than before. She introduced herself as Linda Rodriguez, and the little girl clinging to her hand was Emma. With them was a man who seemed uncomfortable in his skin, constantly checking the windows and doorway as if expecting trouble to follow them even here. Linda's English was broken but heartfelt as she struggled to express her gratitude. "You saved my baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she squeezed Jessica's uninjured hand. "You saved my Emma. I never forget. Never." The man with her remained silent throughout the visit, but Jessica caught him studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. They stayed for less than 10 minutes, and when they left, Jessica felt more unsettled than before their arrival. There had been something desperate in Linda's goodbye, as if she were saying farewell to someone she would never see again. The man had pressed a business card into Jessica's palm, blank except for a phone number written in careful script, and whispered, "If anything strange happens, call this number immediately." That night, Jessica lay awake, listening to the sounds of the hospital around her. Footsteps in the hallway, the distant chime of elevators, the murmur of late-shift conversations at the nurse's station. But underneath these familiar sounds, she heard something else, or thought she did. The soft scrape of shoes that didn't belong to hospital staff, pausing outside her door for just a moment too long before continuing down the hallway. When she was finally discharged 3 days later, Jessica returned home to find her apartment exactly as she'd left it, but somehow everything felt different. Tyler had stayed with her neighbor Mrs. Anderson, who had taken excellent care of him, but even his enthusiastic welcome couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from shadows she couldn't see. The first few days passed normally enough. Jessica moved carefully, still healing from her wounds, while Tyler hovered around her like a protective guardian. He had been told she'd been hurt helping someone, and his 7-year-old mind had processed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes displayed in the face of adult complexities. But Jessica noticed him checking on her more frequently, as if he feared she might disappear if he looked away too long. It was on the 5th night after her return that the phone calls began. The first one came at 11:30, just after she'd settled into bed with a book she was too nervous to actually read. The phone rang twice before stopping, then immediately started again. When she answered, there was only silence on the other end, not the empty silence of a disconnected line, but the weighted quiet of someone listening. "Hello?" Jessica said again, her voice smaller than she intended. Still nothing, but she could swear she heard breathing. After 30 seconds that felt like an hour, the line went dead. She told herself it was a wrong number, a prank call, anything except what her instincts were screaming, that someone was testing to see if she was home, if she was alone, if she was vulnerable. The calls continued over the next few days, always late at night, always the same pattern of silence followed by disconnection. Jessica stopped answering, but the ringing itself became a form of torture, marking the hours of darkness when sleep eluded her completely. She found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her doors and windows, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. Then came the night she saw the shadow outside her kitchen window. It was past midnight, and she'd been pacing her apartment like a caged animal, too wired to sleep despite her exhaustion. As she passed the window, movement in the courtyard below caught her eye. A figure stood motionless beside the dumpsters, face turned up toward her building. Even from 3 floors up, Jessica could feel the intensity of their gaze. She ducked below the windowsill, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it could be heard through the walls. When she found the courage to look again, the figure was gone, leaving her to wonder if she'd imagined the entire thing. But the business card Linda's companion had given her seemed to burn in her nightstand drawer, and she found herself staring at the phone number until the digits blurred together. On the 7th night after her discharge, exactly 48 hours after she'd first seen the shadow in the courtyard, the doorbell rang. Jessica was curled on the couch with Tyler, both of them drowsy from watching an old animated movie, when the sound cut through their peaceful evening like a knife. Tyler looked up at her with curious eyes, but Jessica felt ice water flood her veins. Nobody visited them after 9 o'clock, 2-7. Nobody rang their doorbell unannounced, especially not with the careful, measured pressure of someone who didn't want to seem threatening. Jessica gathered Tyler into her arms, shushing his questions with a gentle hand over his mouth, and crept toward the front door. The peephole revealed nothing but empty hallway, but something on the floor caught her eye. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just wide enough to see what had been left for her. A black box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sat on her doormat like a malevolent gift. No delivery slip, no return address, no indication of where it had come from or who had brought it. Jessica looked both ways down the hallway, confirming she was alone, before quickly pulling the box inside and relocking her door. Tyler watched with wide eyes as she set the box on their small dining table, his childish curiosity warring with the tension radiating from his mother. "What is it, Mom?" he whispered, and Jessica realized she had no idea how to answer that question. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing contents that made her blood turn to slush in her veins. Photographs, dozens of them, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Pictures of her leaving the hospital, of her walking Tyler to school, of her grocery shopping just that afternoon. Someone had been following her every move, documenting her routines, learning her vulnerabilities. But it was the items beneath the photographs that truly terrified her. A set of keys she'd never seen before, attached to a keychain bearing the logo of a storage facility across town. A folded piece of paper with an address written in the same careful script as the phone number she'd been given. And at the bottom of the box, a single sentence typed on plain white paper. "They will come for you. This is your only chance." Jessica's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the note. Tyler had climbed onto a chair beside her, trying to see into the box, and she quickly closed the lid before he could glimpse the photographs. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Who were they? What did they want with her? And why was someone trying to help her when she didn't even understand what kind of danger she was in? The business card seemed to pulse with urgency in her nightstand drawer, and Jessica made a decision that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. She was going to call the number, consequences be damned. But first, she needed to get Tyler somewhere safe. Mrs. Anderson had already done so much, but this was an emergency that transcended normal neighborly favors. "Baby," she said, kneeling down to meet Tyler's eyes. "Remember how we practiced what to do if there was ever a fire or an emergency?" He nodded solemnly, his 7-year-old intuition picking up on the gravity in her voice. "I need you to go pack your overnight bag right now. We're going to visit Mrs. Anderson, and you might need to stay with her for a few days." As Tyler scurried to his room, Jessica called her neighbor, grateful that the older woman was a night owl who wouldn't be disturbed by the late hour. Mrs. Anderson asked no questions, simply agreeing to take Tyler for as long as necessary, and within 30 minutes, Jessica was kissing her son goodbye at her neighbor's door. Back in her apartment, the black box seemed to mock her from the dining table. Jessica pulled out the business card and dialed the number with fingers that refused to stop trembling. It rang only once before a man's voice answered, alert despite the late hour. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said without preamble. "My name is Detective Mike Harrison. I've been working with the FBI on a case involving the Petrov crime organization. The little girl you saved, Emma Rodriguez, her mother witnessed a murder committed by Petrov's people 3 months ago. They've been hunting Linda and Emma ever since." Jessica's legs gave out, and she sank into one of her dining chairs as the pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. "The shooting at the store," she whispered. "It wasn't random." No, it wasn't, too. The gunman was Alex Petrov himself, looking to eliminate the witness and her daughter. When you saved Emma, you became a loose end in their eyes. Someone who could identify Alex, someone who might complicate their plans. Detective Harrison's voice was gentle but urgent. "Jessica, they're coming for you tonight. The keys in that box will lead you to evidence that can bring down their entire operation, but only if you move right now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jessica processed this information. She had stumbled into the middle of a war she didn't understand, and now she was being hunted by people who killed witnesses as casually as other people swatted flies. The keys felt heavy in her palm as she clutched them, a lifeline and a death sentence wrapped in cheap metal. "Where do I go?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Somewhere deep inside, A survival instinct she didn't know she possessed was taking control, pushing her fear aside in favor of cold, practical thinking. The storage facility on Elm Street, Unit 47. Inside, you'll find everything Linda managed to photograph before she went into hiding. Financial records, meeting locations, evidence of murders going back years. Take it all and meet me at the address that was in the box. And Jessica? Detective Harrison paused, and she could hear the weight of experience in his silence. Trust no one else. Petrov has people everywhere, including some who wear badges. The line went dead, leaving Jessica alone with the terrifying knowledge that her simple act of maternal courage had thrust her into a deadly game of cat and mouse. She looked around her small apartment at the life she'd built from nothing and realized she might be saying goodbye to it forever. But Tyler was safe, and that was all that mattered now. Jessica grabbed her purse and car keys, pausing only to scribble a note for Mrs. Anderson in case something happened to her. Take care of Tyler. Tell him his mother loved him more than the whole world. She sealed the note in an envelope and slipped it under her neighbor's door, then walked into the night that would either destroy her or set her free. The storage facility sat at the edge of town like a collection of metal crypts, each unit holding someone's abandoned memories or forgotten treasures. Jessica's footsteps echoed off the concrete as she made her way to Unit 47, the keys cutting into her palm where she gripped them too tightly. Security lights cast harsh shadows between the rows, and every sound made her jump. Unit 47 opened with a metallic screech that seemed to announce her presence to the entire world. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, and Jessica could see that someone, Linda, presumably, had labeled them with dates and locations in her careful handwriting. This wasn't just evidence, it was a chronicle of systematic corruption and murder spanning years. Jessica began loading boxes into her car, her movements quick and efficient despite the panic thrumming through her system. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. Photographs of meetings between Petrov associates and city council members. Documentation of drug shipments and money laundering operations. Each box represented years of patient investigation by a woman who had watched her husband die for trying to expose the truth. She was loading the last box when she heard the engines. 2 black SUVs were racing toward the storage facility, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. Jessica slammed her trunk closed and dove into the driver's seat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. The chase that followed felt like something from a nightmare. Jessica's small sedan was no match for the powerful vehicles pursuing her, but she had the advantage of knowing the local roads better than her pursuers. She took turns at dangerous speeds, ran red lights, and drove through neighborhoods where she'd never imagined fear could follow her. The address Detective Harrison had given her led to an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town. Jessica pulled up to the loading dock with her pursuers still several blocks behind her, thanks to a risky shortcut through a construction zone that had slowed the heavier SUVs. She grabbed the most important box of evidence and ran toward the warehouse entrance, her healing wounds protesting with every step. Detective Harrison was waiting inside, along with 2 other men who introduced themselves as FBI agents. They took the evidence with grateful efficiency, assuring Jessica that this was exactly what they needed to bring federal charges against the entire Petrov organization. But their celebration was short-lived. The sound of car doors slamming outside announced that their hiding place had been discovered. "There's a back exit," Detective Harrison said, herding Jessica toward the rear of the warehouse. "Agent Davis will take you to a safe house while we handle this." But even as he spoke, Jessica could see armed figures moving through the windows. They were surrounded, trapped in a building that had become their tomb. The final confrontation unfolded with brutal efficiency. Alex Petrov himself led the assault, his cold eyes fixing on Jessica with the same lethal intent she'd seen in the grocery store. "You should have died with the child," he said in accented English, raising his weapon with practiced ease. "Now you die with the evidence." But Detective Harrison and his team had prepared for this possibility. Federal marshals who had been waiting in nearby buildings moved in with tactical precision, surrounding the warehouse and cutting off all escape routes. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense, ending with Alex Petrov bleeding out on the concrete floor while his surviving associates were taken into custody. Jessica sat in the back of an ambulance afterward, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders while paramedics checked her for injuries she couldn't even feel. The evidence she'd risked everything to preserve was already being processed, and Detective Harrison assured her that Linda and Emma would finally be safe to come out of hiding. "You did something incredible tonight," he told her as dawn began to break over the city. "Not just saving that little girl, but bringing down an organization that's terrorized this community for years. You should be proud." But as Jessica was driven home, she felt more exhausted than proud. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made her wonder if she'd ever feel safe again. She had survived, but survival and living weren't the same thing. The woman who walked back into her apartment that morning was different from the one who had left it the night before. Mrs. Anderson met her at the door with Tyler, who flew into her arms with the uncomplicated joy of a child who knew only that his mother had come home. Jessica held him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair, while her neighbor bustled around making coffee and asking gentle questions about where she'd been. Life settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. The trial made national news, and Jessica found herself testifying before grand juries about what she'd witnessed and experienced. Linda and Emma came to visit once the danger had passed, their gratitude profound but no longer shadowed by fear. The little girl had drawn pictures for Jessica, crayon masterpieces showing two stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. But even as the external threats faded, Jessica found herself changed by the experience in ways both subtle and profound. She was more aware of her surroundings, more conscious of the fragility of the peaceful life she'd built. The sound of unexpected visitors still made her heart race, and she'd installed better locks and a security system that would have seemed paranoid just months earlier. Most mornings now began with a ritual she'd never needed before. Jessica would stand at her kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, scanning the courtyard below for signs of anything unusual. It was a small price to pay for peace of mind, she told herself, though she sometimes wondered if true peace was something she'd ever experience again. Tyler had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that children often displayed in the face of change. He understood that his mother was famous for helping someone, and he was proud of her in the uncomplicated way of childhood. Sometimes Jessica caught him watching her with an expression too serious for his years, as if he sensed the weight she now carried. But mostly he remained the joyful, chattering boy who had always been her anchor to normalcy. 3 months after the warehouse confrontation, Jessica received a package in the mail that made her hands tremble as she held it. No return address, but postmarked from a city she'd never visited. Inside was a photograph of Emma Rodriguez on her first day at a new school, grinning toothlessly at the camera while Linda smiled behind her. On the back, Linda had written simply, "Safe because of you. Thank you forever." Jessica kept the photograph on her refrigerator next to Tyler's latest artwork, a reminder that her moment of courage had created ripples, extending far beyond what she could see. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and her thoughts turned to the path not taken, she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she'd chosen differently that day in the store. The answer always came back the same: she couldn't have chosen differently. The same maternal instinct that made her sacrifice everything for a stranger's child was the force that had shaped every important decision in her life. It was what had given her the strength to leave Tyler's father when his drinking became dangerous. It was what drove her to work double shifts to keep them afloat financially. And it was what would continue to guide her choices, even if they led her into darkness again. 6 months after the shooting, on a quiet Saturday morning in March, Jessica was making pancakes while Tyler built elaborate structures with his breakfast sausages. The sun streamed through their kitchen window, and the radio played soft jazz that made the whole apartment feel warm and golden. For the first time in months, Jessica felt something approaching genuine contentment. That's when the doorbell rang. Jessica's hand froze on the spatula, pancake batter dripping onto the stovetop as her body flooded with familiar adrenaline. Tyler looked up from his sausage construction project, noting the sudden tension in his mother's posture. "Mom, are you okay?" She forced herself to breathe normally, to remember that the Petrov organization was finished, that the men who had hunted her were dead or imprisoned. This was probably just a neighbor, or maybe someone collecting for charity. Normal people rang doorbells for normal reasons, and she needed to learn to be normal again. "It's fine, baby," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she walked toward the front door. "Just someone visiting." But her steps were careful, measured, and she found herself checking the locks before looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but on the doormat sat another package. This one was smaller than the black box that had changed her life, wrapped in brown paper with no identifying marks. Jessica's throat went dry as she recognized the careful, measured placement that suggested whoever had left it didn't want to be seen. She opened the door just wide enough to retrieve the package, scanning the hallway in both directions before quickly stepping back inside and engaging the deadbolt. Tyler was watching her from the kitchen doorway, his young face creased with concern that broke her heart. "Mom, you're scaring me," he said in a small voice, and Jessica realized she was breathing too fast, moving with the jerky urgency of barely controlled panic. She forced herself to slow down, to smile at her son with something approaching normalcy. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Mommy's just being extra careful." She set the package on the dining table, noting that her hands were steady now despite the fear coursing through her system. "Why don't you go wash up while I see what this is?" Tyler hesitated for a moment, clearly wanting to stay and witness whatever was about to unfold, but Jessica's gentle firmness sent him toward the bathroom. She waited until she heard the water running before opening the package with fingers that had learned to expect the worst. Inside was a single photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged with graying hair and kind eyes, standing outside a courthouse with what appeared to be his family. The note was written in the same careful script she'd seen before, but this message was different from the warnings that had preceded it. "The trial is over, but justice continues. This man helped convict the people who hurt your family. He needs what you provided. The choice is always yours, but some fights are worth continuing." Jessica stared at the photograph for a long time, studying the man's face and trying to understand what was being asked of her. Someone, somewhere, was fighting another battle against corruption and violence. Someone needed help, and the person writing these notes believed Jessica was the right person to provide it. She thought about Linda and Emma, safe now in their new life because Jessica had been willing to step into danger. She thought about all the other families who might be living in fear, waiting for someone brave enough to make a difference. And she thought about Tyler, who deserved to grow up in a world where good people were willing to stand up to evil, even when it cost them everything. The doorbell rang again, and this time Jessica didn't hesitate. She walked to the door with purpose, checking the peephole and seeing a woman roughly her own age standing in the hallway. The woman's posture was familiar, the same tense alertness Jessica had recognized in Linda that day at the park. This was someone running from danger, someone who needed help. Jessica opened the door, and the woman looked up with desperate hope in her eyes. "Are you Jessica Williams?" she asked in a voice that shook with exhaustion and fear. "Someone told me you might be willing to help. My name is Catherine Brooks, and they took my daughter." Standing there in her doorway, looking at another mother's terror, Jessica felt the familiar fire of maternal instinct igniting in her chest. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to close the door and call the police. But Jessica had learned that sometimes the smart thing and the right thing were completely different choices. She stepped aside to let Catherine Brooks into her apartment, and as she closed the door behind them, Jessica realized she had found her answer to the question that had been haunting her for months. She couldn't choose differently, because this was who she was, a mother who couldn't stand by while other mothers suffered. The doorbell had rung again, and once more, Jessica Williams was going to answer its call.